Hello, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. It's a great privilege for me to introduce the keynote speaker of the conference, Dr. Vipin Kumar, who's a Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota, where he also holds the William Norris Endowed Chair in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering. He is also currently the Director of the Data Science Initiative at University of Minnesota. Vipin is a leading researcher, a pioneer in the field of artificial intelligence AI, particularly in the areas of data mining, machine learning, high performance computing, and their applications in climate, ecosystems, and healthcare. Out of the several accolades and fellowships and awards, let me highlight just two. His research has been honored by the ACM SIG KDD 2012 Innovation Award, which is the highest award for technical excellence in the field of KDD, and the 2016 IEEE Computer Society Sydney Fernbach Award, which is the highest award for excellence in the area of high performance computing. He has authored many papers, including two widely used textbooks, Introduction to Parallel Computing, Introduction to Data Mining. His current research focuses on bringing the power of data and machine learning to understand the impact of human-induced changes on the Earth and its environment. So with that, let me introduce Vipin Kumar.
Thank you, Anuj, and thanks. It has been a pleasure to attend these meetings since morning. So as Anuj said, I'll be talking about what machine learning, especially machine learning that's guided by scientific knowledge, could do to address some of the biggest environmental challenges that are facing the humanity. And I'm also hoping to sort of give a sense that these advances in knowledge-guided machine learning are actually very relevant for this group as well. So what are these environmental challenges? And let me... So of course, we hear about climate change is one of the defining challenge for the society. The impact of the humans are changing the chemistry of the atmosphere. As a result, the global temperatures are increasing, and there are all sorts of consequences. And it's becoming more and more clear that the impacts of global warming are going to be very, very serious. You see them already in the form of increasing frequencies of forest fires, droughts, floods, hurricanes, and so forth. Right? So this is all happening. There is urgency to act, and what I want to sort of remind you, everybody, is that that's a great challenge, but it's only one of the many environmental challenges that we face as a humanity. The second one, of course, we face is how do we feed the world its growing population without really destroying the biodiversity of the planet. And just to give you a sense, in year 2000, we were about 6 billion people on the Earth, and about a year and a half ago, we already had crossed 8 billion mark. Okay? So the population went up by more than 33% in just a matter of 2 decades, just a little bit over 2 decades. Now, and the population was, if you go back to the pre-industrial era, it was about 500 million people on the planet. So as the population has increased, one of the ways humanity has coped with it is to clear more forest and use them for agriculture. And when you do that, and as you see here in this picture, that's right from Indonesia, the right side of this picture, on the right side is dense forest, and the left side are the oil palm plantations. And the oil palm plantation initially were considered to be a solution to the climate change problem because oil palm could be used potentially as a fuel. Then it turned out people figured out very quickly that the conversion of forest to oil palm plantation releases so much carbon that it's going to take hundreds of years, at least 100 years, before you can recoup what you lost. So this is actually not a very good solution. So that's another big problem, which is the biodiversity challenge problem. And of course, a lot of people are studying it from many different perspectives. Tanya gave a beautiful keynote on this at KDD just a few weeks ago, focusing entirely on biodiversity. The third big challenge is happening at sort of, again, from a different direction, which is the increasing nitrification of waterways and oceans. And what happens is that as we try to grow food, as we try to improve the productivity of the agricultural land, so that we don't have to cut more trees, we have to use fertilizer. You have to use nutrients to improve the productivity. And when you do that, a lot of it gets washed away into the rivers and then goes into the ocean. And what you're seeing in the bottom right figure is the colors are representing where all of this nutrient is leaching into the waterways, and then eventually coming into the delta of Mississippi. And you can see a huge dead zone being formed in the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, the problem is not just in the ocean. Wherever you see these green regions or the red regions, what you're sort of seeing is the water quality being impacted in these regions. So the farmers, the rural population that's living there, they don't have access to good quality water. They have to treat it, and that's very, very expensive and not very useful. So this is another big challenge. It's an immediate challenge in the sense of water quality not being good, but it's also a long-term challenge. That is, if oceans nitrify enough, the ocean's life would die, and if all ocean's life die, the planet would die. There'll be no life on Earth if there is no life in the ocean. And the last big challenge I want to mention is that as we try to tackle climate change, as we try to do everything to mitigate it, and we have to sort of get to the net zero, the zero carbon future. And of course, we do that in terms of fossil fuel by converting them to renewable energy. But with agriculture, just the process of producing food to keep us all alive produces a lot of carbon. There's a lot of carbon that used to be in the soil, which gets emitted as we use these current agricultural practices, and as we put more fertilizer into the soil to make it more productive, and it releases very powerful greenhouse gas emissions, gases, which are actually much more potent even than carbon dioxide. So one of the big objectives is to see how do we transform agriculture to make it net zero, or perhaps even make it net negative, because if we can transform it in a way that agriculture would lead to putting more carbon into the soil, we could actually have a bigger impact on the overall climate change problem. So the point here is that there are a lot of these challenges that are sort of being that face the humanity. They all interact with each other. And there are multitudes of scientific communities that are trying to study these questions. And next. Okay, so some of the big questions that are studied by the community are, well, how do we better understand the global carbon cycle? How do we sort of get to the net zero future? How do we make how do you adapt to some of the disasters that we're going to face? So it's basically, they sort of talk about things like, how do you manage the how do you learn to adapt to unmanageable situation, and how do you make sure what we cannot manage does not happen? So mitigation is about trying to make sure things don't become too bad, and adaptation is about, well, what is going to happen? How do we adapt to it, right? How do you reduce the pollution in the water, and how do you sort of make the agriculture more sustainable? So these are all interacting sort of scientific questions, and there are a vast number of communities that sort of study them. And of course, and how do they study them? They basically try to build a model of the environmental system. And this is a caricature here that you see on the top of the slide. There's a system that you're trying to model. It could be a farmland, it could be a river, it could be a lake, it could be a larger region of the surface of the earth. And it's being impacted by weather, a bunch of drivers, including weather. You may be interested in a response, like, what is the amount of stream flow, which could lead to figure out whether there'll be droughts or floods. You may be interested in looking at the temperature, which determines the health of the lake ecosystems. You may be interested in figuring out what is the yield of the crop that you're growing, or what is the how much is the greenhouse that's being emitted from the farming practices. And the relationship between this response and the drivers can be determined by a whole bunch of things, including what is the characteristic of the land, what may be the management practices, and what's the soil, nature of the soil, and so forth. And a lot of this behavior could be observed from sensors and including especially the remote sensors and even including the Earth observing satellites. And one could try to build oftentimes the scientists would build process-based model, which are typically called forward model, in which you're given the physical drivers and system characteristics, you're trying to learn to predict the response. And in some cases, you're looking at the inverse modeling, that is, if you have the response and the physical driver, can you observe the underlying characteristics? And I'm showing you two caricatures of the examples here on the left side. One could be a hydrological system in which you're trying to figure out how much is the flow from the river to figure out whether there'll be droughts or the floods, or a lake which would be impacted by the weather and also by human actions, and it may be changing its temperature profile, and whether the water could be used for drinking and so forth. So these are all the kinds of, these are the caricature example of what would typically persons study in environmental sciences to study the kind of questions we talked about on the previous slide. So why is it that scientists are sort of looking to our community to answer these questions? And the reason is that the process-based models that are used to solve these problems try to represent the underlying phenomena, the biological, physical, chemical phenomena via equations and via some sort of caricatures. And they are trying to incorporate physics into those processes. And invariably, the model that you build for an environmental system would be incomplete or would have missing physics, because being able to represent the phenomena at the level of precision that you need would require too much computing or too much knowledge, or that you may not have. So as a result, these physics-based, process-based models are often approximation of the reality because of the scale accuracy trade-off and you can look at sort of any discipline, and you will sort of face this problem. And as a result, that these models have an inherent bias. That means there is something that they cannot represent as well as you would like them to do. So this would sort of cut across any scientific discipline in which you're trying to do the modeling of a phenomena. The second thing is that even as you try to build these models, you often have to parameterize. And as an example, let's say you were trying to model the hydrology of a basin, you have to model the quality of soil, how absorbent the soil is, for example, of water. Now, soil can have multiple layers, and you could try an approximation. The soil has only a single layer. You'll have only one parameter to estimate as to how absorbent the soil is. But soil can have multiple layers, and each of them can have different amount of absorbent. And that means if you have more layers, you can approximate the reality more precisely, but then you need more parameters that have to be calibrated. So these parameters have to be calibrated, and when you have only limited amount of observations, which is very easy to overfit, this problem is called equifinality. That is, you can have different realization of the system, completely different realization for the wrong reason, and that's a serious problem. Something that we don't really end up studying in machine learning because we only look for the accuracy. And the third problem that's just very, very serious is that these process-based models make very inefficient use of the observations. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. Let's say if I'm trying to understand the hydrology of a catchment, or I'm trying to figure out the impact of certain management practices on greenhouse gas emission from agriculture, both of these things depend a lot about where this basin or farm may be located. And if you look around the Earth, there'll be the Earth is very heterogeneous, and I'm just showing you 4 different sort of pictures. That could be coming from the flat regions, could be coming from mountains, could be coming from deserts, and each of these places will have very different behavior in terms of how the drivers impact the response. Now, when you have this kind of heterogeneity, and if it turns out, let's say in the United States alone, there are, depending on at what level you sort of look at these hydrological basins, there are thousands of basins that you could be modeling. And for some of these basins, you may have a lot of data, and for some of them, you may have very little data. And even if you had, even if you are in North America, a lot of these basins do have a lot of data. But if you go outside North America, you will find many, many regions of the world where you have very sparse data. But the question is, if you have built a model and it does really, really well in a certain region because you have spent time and money and resources to collect a lot of observations to calibrate the model. But then if you go to a different region, to a different basin, which is for you have to collect the data again all over the place. So the process models benefit from more observations via better calibration, but that improvement in calibration does not translate to a different region. For every region, you need more data, which means it's a very inefficient way to sort of make use of the data. So these are some of the biggest limitations of process models. These are not the only ones, but these are some of the biggest limitations. And as a result, the scientists, physical scientists in all communities you can sort of see them being interested in figuring out how to use machine learning. So there's an increasing interest in harnessing the data revolution for scientific discovery. Literally, the program named NSF program that funds this collection of institute. And there's tremendous interest. And what I want to remind people is that the Harnessing Data Revolution program is actually, it's been around for, as you heard, about 10 years. And these two articles that you see here, the new journal articles, the cover magazines of Nature and Science, they actually come from 2009, which means the interest in this area is not just recent, but it's about 15 years, at least 15 years old. So this is, for a long time, people are thinking, how could we leverage the power of machine learning, power of data revolution for advancing the discovery in their field. And the question is, and of course, you could literally go to any scientific community meetings and you will see people bringing in machine learning into their applications. AGU, which is one of the largest gathering of geoscientists in the world, about 30,000 people show up for this meeting in December. 25 years ago, when I used to go to the meeting, there will be hardly anyone like me, like computer scientist. And today, at least 10%, 15% of the sessions are focused entirely on machine learning. So the question is, how come machine learning hasn't solved their problems, given that it has solved so many things? And the problem is that there are some very serious limitations of the black box machine learning approaches for scientific discovery. And that is one of them, of course, is machine learning successes that you have seen, especially recently. They're built in situations where you have a lot of data, internet scale data. And which is not quite possible in these physical problems because of heterogeneity I mentioned. Like you can collect a lot of data in one place, but you can't take it to another place. Second thing is they can generate physically inconsistent results because these machine learning models are, at the end of the day, they're looking for statistical relationship, very powerful statistical relationship in the data that you give it for training, which means they have no understanding of what the underlying laws are. And the downside of both of these is that these methods then are unable to generalize to scenarios that have not been seen before. And scientists would never want to take a gadget or a model that seems to work well in the data that was given to them for training, but would not work in a situation which is completely different. So this is perhaps one of the biggest reasons people are very hesitant to use them. And of course, the fourth one is equally important. That is, the scientific community advance by learning layers of knowledge. And just because you have improved the predictive power of certain process, even if it works in scenarios not unseen, you have not advanced science, and that sort of is a big limitation. So because of all of these limitations, there have been, and we have had some major failures. Google flu trend is a failure from about 12 years ago. Again, Meta's foundation model is more recent, and as a result, there is a hesitation in people to use these methodologies. Okay. But I just want to sort of add one more comment here in light of the comment made by Dean Rashid this morning, and as he mentioned that, look, today, with the success of foundation model, we are wondering whether we even teach differential equations to the engineering student, right? And again, he was a smart guy. He sort of said, the answer is no. He himself said that, right? And what this slide is trying to tell you is why the answer should be no, right? Because of all of these reasons. Because So his instinct is captured in a way that I'm sort of putting on this slide, right? And this instinct, of course, today, statements like those are being made by people like Dean Rashid, who is, of course, very established researcher in his field. But 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, people who from our community, from the data science community, machine learning community, were making statements like this: end of theory, data deluge makes scientific methods obsolete. I mean, this is, or even more recently, after the ChatGPT, are we witnessing the dawn of the post-theory science? So people think that perhaps we could forget the theory, we could forget the science thing. And what this slide is telling you is that, no, that we should be cautious. This is not a way to do things. Now, the next slide is sort of capturing the state of the art. We have two different dimensions, two different types of scientific methods. One of them is based upon scientific theories, which is process-based methods that of course, are very powerful, but they're limited by our current scientific understanding. So they have limitations. I talked about them quite extensively. The other are the data science models that have tremendous success in areas like computer vision and language modeling, but they can easily fail to generalize in scenarios when data is not representative. And both of them use two key components of knowledge discovery, scientific theory and data. So the vertical dimension uses primarily scientific theory, and the black box model uses primarily data. And this method, this new direction of machine learning that's guided by scientific knowledge is the theory, the idea behind this, that you want to combine these two. You don't want to ignore one or the other. So the idea is that you're building on the foundation of scientific information, scientific knowledge, and you're taking full advantage of them along with the advances that machine learning has made in the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Okay? So this is the key. And again, and this direction is being pursued around the world from multiple directions in our own group. We started thinking about it in 2014, about almost 10 years ago, but the most foundational paper actually was written 7 years ago, and Anuj Karpal was the lead author of that article. Now, this area, of course, is called sometimes as physics-guided machine learning, physics-informed machine learning, physics-aware AI, basically, but we sort of treat physics as more, we use scientific knowledge to sort of use that this is an area which is much more general than any of these. KGML is a rapidly growing community. There are numerous workshops, surveys, vision papers at the AAAI, at many other conferences and meetings. There is a survey that appeared in ACM Computing Survey article about 2 years ago that covered 350 articles published up to that point in the previous 4 or 5 years. All of them were published in previous 4 or 5 years. There's a book on KGML. And it's a very, very rich history is being used in every single discipline you can imagine. And this talk is to give you a very brief overview of some of the work in this area and some of the advances, again, coming from a very narrow lens of what's happening in my group. So this is this is a perspective article. When I've given these talks literally dozens of times, people sort of said, well, how do we get started in this area? So this slide, this led to sort of this perspective article, knowledge-guided machine learning, current trends and future prospects. And this basically takes all of these pieces of work that are going on and provides sort of captures them in sort of a structured manner. So all these thousands of papers that you can find in this area at the intersection of scientific knowledge and machine learning, that is machine learning that is driven by scientific knowledge, you can sort of group them, you can look at them from multiple dimensions. That is, what is the knowledge that's being represented? Okay? Is it PDEs? Is it scientific laws? PDEs might have the complete solution to your problem, but you're trying to solve it, and you just need to solve it fast. It could be very expensive to solve it otherwise. So your interest may be that I know what my model is, I just need to solve it fast. You may just know about scientific law, that you may already know that mass needs to be balanced, so energy needs to be conserved. Or there could be symmetries that you're aware of, or you could have knowledge graphs, or you may have just a mechanistic model that you happen to use that you have built for your for modeling your system. And of course, mechanistic model is not complete because it's making the scale accuracy trade-off. So it could be, depending on which of these formats you're using, there'll be approaches that you can use to exploit those knowledge. That scientific knowledge could be perfect, for example, in the case of a PD-based model, or could be imperfect and partial. And again, whole spectrum can be there. Form of knowledge, how do you integrate knowledge and machine learning together? It could be purely machine learning centric. That means I take the machine learning model and inject knowledge into it. Or it could be completely process centric, that I have a physical model and I'm trying to tweak it a little bit to bring it closer to machine learning. And it could be somewhere in between. And I could be bringing these different types of knowledge that I'm trying to represent in different ways. I could bring them into the learning framework. I could sort of bring them into the architecture of the machine learning, or I could just simply use it for pre-training. So these are all the different kinds of ways I could sort of look at the research in this area. And again, this is captured in this future prospects paper, perspective paper. And then there is this tutorial that Anuj presented at a workshop recently, which you can capture from this, from the code on the top. And it's just captured the entire structure to it. I'll just, in a slide or two, I'll just give you a little brief view into it. That is, if I'm trying to incorporate scientific knowledge into machine learning, I could improve in the learning framework by modifying the loss function. That is, I could just basically bring in the law of conservation, the law of the PD-based loss into the traditional model building process, which is primarily focused on model complexity and predictive accuracy. But you can add the scientific components to it, and then it can help you manage those conservation laws and so forth. You could be building a architecture that is, rather than treating the machine learning as a black box in which you fit in the input and you get the output, you can design the innards of the machine learning framework in a way that it reflects the relationship among different physical variables and processes that are evolving and interacting at different spatial and temporal scale. Something potentially a machine learning algorithm could learn if it was given massive amount of data, but if you have limited amount of data, then it's much better to sort of create the structure in a way that it honors those. Or you could use the methods for pre-training the model that are guided by scientific knowledge. And this is, of course, an area which has been responsible for literally all of the advances that you've seen in machine learning the last 10 years. That is, if you go back 10 years ago, one of the first papers that sort of used a large amount of information on the internet to build the representations for word, the word to back, which led to literally a sequence of things that brought us to ChatGPT today, was self-supervision. That is, you have a lot of data, you don't need any labels. You're simply trying to figure out you're simply trying to leverage the regularity in our language, in the text. That is, if I take any long sentence, hide a word in it, I should be able to recreate it from the context. And then the process of doing that allows you to build representations that are so powerful that you reach a point where you can translate any language into another. And again, the same thing with a few other developments led to language models and all the excitement that you see today, right? But in the scientific domain, the self-supervision can be guided by the knowledge in the head of the scientist, or what people have learned over the period of centuries. And if nothing else, you can use the imperfect mechanistic models to serve as pre-trainer. So there are a tremendous number of successes. If you look at the thousands of papers that have been published, quite a few of them would simply be looking at the knowledge-guided learning or the knowledge-guided pre-training, because these are the easiest thing for you to bring in. And then increasingly, there are a lot of works on trying to figure out how do you take the information about the structure of processes and their interaction and bring them into the machine learning architectures. And I just want to sort of remind people, I mentioned that the formats used for representing knowledge can vary tremendously, from PDEs to mechanistic models and so forth. But if you have your representation as PDEs, and if you think it's perfect, then one of the most common way of bringing that is to bring in the PD-based loss into the machine learning framework, neural network, and PIN, physics-informed neural networks, are among the very popular methodologies that are widely applicable in certain subdisciplines like fluid dynamics and structural mechanics and so forth. Okay, so with that, I just want to sort of bring you back to the environmental problem. and how KGML could potentially address the limitations of the process-based model in solving them. And again, even though my focus is primarily environmental problem, but comments apply all across. So I mentioned to you the limitations of the traditional process-based model, that they have incomplete physics, they have unknown parameter that have to be calibrated, and they make very inefficient use of the observations. Now, because KGML is built on machine learning, it is not limited by the missing physics because it's learning from the data. So that means the first limitation, there's a potential that it does not apply. Okay? But the machine learning really needs a lots of sample. And one of the first things that KGML does is that because of the methodology that I just talked about, they can provide high predictive power even with sparse observations because they're leveraging scientific knowledge. They're leveraging these laws, symmetries, and so forth. They can also generalize to unseen scenarios in the following sense. If you have a machine learning algorithm, it is bound to find patterns in the data that you give it. But because you're able to enforce constraints, scientific constraints, you can go out of sample much more efficiently than a traditional machine learning application. They can produce physically consistent results. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly in many cases, that you can leverage information from highly observed entities to provide high quality prediction in unobserved and sparsely observed entities. So I'm making a whole bunch of claims here. And what I'm going to do, since my time is short, I'm just going to flash examples of how these things have been done in different contexts. And then, of course, you can follow up and read the papers if you need to. But these are all problems in many cases of regional scales, national scale, or global scale. That is, the results have been produced at very, very large level. So one of the first one I'm going to sort of mention very briefly, a work that got done in collaboration with the USGS, who happened to read our 2017 paper just as it got published, and contacted us and built a very strong collaboration, and which was like, how do we improve the process, how do we improve the modeling of these lakes ecosystem? There are 185,000 lakes in the US, and the USGS is responsible for figuring out how their temperature behaves in response to the weather, because that is the temperature, the master variable, and determines whether the lake can be used for recreation, whether the water would be safe for people to drink, and a whole bunch of other things. Okay? So within that context, this is a modeling being done only for one lake for right now. And they sort of said, look, here is a lake, Lake Mendota, the most widely used lake in the world, perhaps in the entire world, because USGS has an office right there. They have high quality data observations at every depth of the lake going back into decades, very, very high quality data. Now for that, they have a model called GLM, Generalized Lake Model, which is used in an operational setting by USGS to model the lake temperature dynamics across the US. And you can see that on the Y dimension, on the X dimension, you see the number of observations being used for calibration. Y dimension, you see the quality. As you go up, the quality goes up because the RMSE, the error goes down. And you can see if you use more and more data for observation, the quality improves and it saturates. Now for this one, because we have a lot of data, I can potentially build a black box machine learning algorithm, which is shown in the orange color. And if you have very little data, of course, the performance is not very good. But if you have a lot of data, it actually exceeds the performance of process-based models. Not a surprise. You see the phenomena pretty much anywhere. Okay? But if you combine the power of both machine learning and process-based modeling along the lines I talked about, the multiple dimensions, you actually can supersede all of them. That even with very, very few observations, you can do better than both of them. Okay? Now, the next one is, remember, I sort of said, well, this is doing better with less data. But how about going out of sample scenarios, right? And there was a series of experiments that were done in collaboration with USGS. And this experiment is sort of telling you that if you hide the data about summers and give all three paradigms, the process-based paradigm, black box machine learning paradigm, and KGML paradigm, if you none of them get to see the summer, and they all have access to the other three seasons, what happens then? And then you see that if you reduce the summer data from each of them, the machine learning, of course, dropped like a rock. The orange line just drops like a rock. Machine doesn't know what happens in summer if they've never seen it. The process model also drops big time, not as much as machine learning, because the calibration got done without seeing the sum. But the KGML framework drops very little because it learned the physics from the process model and little bit of information about data from the other three sequences. Again, example that you can sort of go out of sample scenario, you can extrapolate. Okay? This is sort of a more complicated slide. It just goes to show that you can teach the machine learning algorithm the energy balance. I won't go into detail, but it's basically showing that process models and KGML model both can balance the energy in and out, but the plain machine learning model would not. Now, let me come to the last point about going from the highly observed region to less observed region. So that problem is sort of shown as a caricature on this slide. That is, assume you have a bunch of entities. Could be lakes, could be hydrological basins, could be farmlands. And for each entity, you may have data. So basically, the top left, the green box, any entity there, you have a lot of data. The question is, if you go forward, can you make good observation? Could you make good predictions in the yellow region, which is extending into the time? But more importantly, can we extend them into the pink region? That is, can you learn something from entities somewhere that you have a lot of data, and can you go out completely to different domains and learn, do good prediction there? This is one of the hardest problems. And it turns out that the machine learning community has made a lot of advances in the form of multitask learning, transfer learning, few shot learning, zero shot learning. Some of these ideas combined with knowledge guidance can do wonders. And I'm just going to give you examples. And this is an example of how this work done by a PhD student in computer science was able to produce this product for the entire United States for 185,000 lakes, where the data, the USGS has data only for about 12,000 to 227 lakes. So there is no data available for 160,000 lakes. And this methodology of extrapolation produce this data. And of course, it has to be properly validated to become an acceptable data product. This is the first time the ecological community had access to the temperature variations for all of this data made available by the KGML. And again, this shows the power of extrapolation using KGML. This is another example. KGML can leverage data from highly observed entity for sparse entities. As we go to the net zero, and we try to go to the net zero future, we want to make sure the carbon emissions from different parts of the world, we can measure them, we can monitor them, and we can perhaps bring countries who are responsible for them accountable for them, right? So one of the very short way of measuring the emission from these different ecosystems around the world is to put flux towers. If you look at the agricultural scientists, they'll sort of say, well, I put the flux towers, covariate flux towers. They have designed them in such a way that they can do a very good job of monitoring exactly what's happening. But these towers are expensive. They can monitor only an area of a few square kilometers around them, and you can't put them in every single patch on the world. So there are many such flux net data sets available from different organizations. And this one I'm showing you is about 206 eddy covariance towers, stations that are spread around the world. Now, the question is, could I learn a model from a small number of locations where I have the flux towers, and could I translate that information into places where I have no information, right? And of course, we tested the hypothesis here by sort of saying, well, we're going to build a model only using some of the flux towers, and then we will go to the other locations where we have the flux tower, that means you have the ground truth, but we'll not use it and try to make predictions on what it is, right? And this idea of sort of going from highly observed regions to less observed region was actually tried out by a group, a prominent group in climate science. They published a paper in Nature Scientific Data last year using standard machine learning algorithm. But it turns out that if you bring in the KGML component, you can reduce the errors quite dramatically, and you can work with much, much less data. That's what this slide is sort of trying to show you. The next slide is sort of, again, joint work with NOAA, is about being able to make real-time predictions of floods. As I mentioned, one of the biggest challenges of climate change is increasing frequency of droughts and droughts. And the traditional scientific community that sort of makes these observations, they have built techniques like data assimilation. That is, they know exactly what the data is today and use that to inform the prediction into the future. And what this slide is showing you is that if you look at this, if you look at this slide, on the X dimension, you see the days 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 7. 0 means you're sitting, the hydrologist is sitting at this morning, and he's trying to make prediction for the 7 days ahead every 6 hours, about 28 predictions. The stars are the actual river stage observation that were observed. This is data from the past, right? The red line is the standard machine learning algorithm that would make the prediction. The yellow line is the standard machine learning algorithm given the information of the flow at the time, which is comparative with the best data simulation approaches. And the blue line is the KGML approach, which captures the fact that there are processes that are interacting at different scales. And you can see the blue line is able to find out exactly when the river is going to flood and how it's going to recede 7 days in advance. So this sort of shows the power of bringing the two things together. And one of the last thing I'm going to mention is this ability of KGML for greenhouse gas and carbon cycle modeling. This is actually a joint work that started about 4 years ago with Professor Kaiyu Guan, who's sitting in the audience, and one of my collaborators at University of Minnesota, and it sort of led to an AI institute at the University of Minnesota on AI climate. And again, this all is about being able to sort of figure out the impact of different management practices on the carbon emission, because if you can figure out which agricultural practices emit less greenhouse gases, then you can provide carbon credit to the farmer, and you solve the climate problem, you solve the rural economy revitalization. And this graphic here, again, some of the more work presented in the Nature Communication paper is sort of showing that, yes, how KGML is so much better than either of those two approaches. This morning, one of the HDR projects presentations, sort of they asked, he showed you the picture and he asked you how many dams exist in the US, right? That was a sort of a question they asked. So there are people in hydrology, in global hydrology, they're sort of trying to see how many water bodies do we have on the face of the earth. NASA flew a shuttle mission about 24 years ago, collected some data, and their data is used to build these global products. Hydro Lake is one of those products which sort of tells you how many water bodies are there. And this data set produced purely using KGML approaches, produced 3 times as many water bodies that are there on the earth. So look, you see how many are missing. And not only that, it tells you also what the dynamics is, which means it's very easy for you to figure out which of these are dams, which of these may be coming in from mining, could be in the farmland. So all sorts of things can be done. There is a HDR project you heard this morning very extensively about the polar regions and how the glacier dynamics, but one of the bigger, as one that I mentioned this morning, what happens in the poles doesn't stay in the pole, it impacts us all. And one of the things that's happening in the poles is that as these temperatures are warming, and the ice sort of melts. Of course, one aspect is that the glaciers would melt and increase the sea rise. But as the land surface got exposed, it emits a whole bunch of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It creates a very, very, very bad sort of a it's a cycle in the sense that it emits more carbon, Earth gets warmer, and then it sort of, so there's a huge amount of uncertainty as to what these lakes are and what's happening to them. And again, this approach is being used to build very precise maps for the polar region. The next slide, of course, you heard a lot that everybody's thinking about foundation models, and actually already in the geospatial domain, there are already at least half a dozen foundation models built by organizations like NASA and IBM and so forth. And this, which of course require massive amount of data, and again, they're used to pre-train the models for downstream tasks. And this is sort of showing that how you build a foundation model by bringing scientific knowledge into it so that it becomes it can be trained with much less knowledge and then can do predictions that would be very difficult to do otherwise. Again, this is an example of that. I'm going to skip this. And I just want to highlight, again, in Tanya's talk, she mentioned that KGML is a key component of their HDR project. And again, this is you sort of see the examples of knowledge guidance being used in different contexts. So with that, I want to sort of conclude by making a few general comments. My entire talk, you could sort of say on KGML, was about bringing machine learning to address scientific problems and modifying it in the form of KGML uh, to address those problems more effectively. So that you could sort of view that, right? So what I like to sort of restate here is that there's been a growing interest at the intersection of AI for science, right? This is definitely the case today. If you look at in the last 5 years, last 10 years, there's an increasing amount of work that's happening at the intersection. The comment like Dean Rashid made this morning, hey, do we need to teach our students PDs? You could never imagine a comment like that from a dean of engineering school 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, right? So it's clear that there's a huge interest at the interface. And if you are in anywhere in the world working in scientific areas, either you're working at this interface of AI and science, or you're wondering what the heck is happening there. Is it something that's going to eat my lunch if I don't know it, right? And it's happening in medicine, it's happening in science, in every discipline, right? This is there. But what I like to remind people is that scientific applications have been influencing AI research throughout its 60 plus years of history. Yeah, I mean, depending on when you call the origin, whether you call it the origin to be the Turing's utterance that there should be the Turing test, could be 75 years, or whether you take it from the perceptron, it's somewhere about 60 to 70 years, or something like that. So this is a long history. And if you look at the entire history, I broke it down into 3 groups. The group until the 80s, right? This is the region in which the AI sort of was driven by our desire for computers to do things that human can do, right? That we were trying to mimic humans, which is why it was called artificial intelligence, right? But even back then, even in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, scientific problems made an impact. Those of you who used to be in the field in that area would remember a Dendril, a chemistry project to figure out how do you go from mass spec data to what chemicals are there. Some of you may remember the Mycin project, the medicine one. Again, don't worry if you're young, these are all history. And then this period ended with a massive craze about AI. Okay? It's like if you go turn the clock back, if you look at the newspapers, if you look at the research articles from the 85 to 1990, everybody thought expert systems would solve the problem. Like just the kind of craze that you hear today about LLMs and the chat GPT. It was the exact same level of craze, perhaps not as wide, but it was very, very wide there. So basically, and of course, that also was the time when the second generation neural network revolution happened. The first generation neural network happened in the 50s. So the beginning of this 3-decade area, the first generation happened, it came as a blip and went away. And at the end of it, second generation revolution happened, right? But even in this period, there was an interaction between AI science, but the entire focus was how do we get computers to do things that humans cannot do. Then starting 1990s all the way, and I'm putting the date on 2012, but it's arbitrary, but it's about 22 years period. It was all driven by big data. Okay, the huge community sort of grew up. If you look at all of the advances in that period, you will see a lot of the advances being made in an area which is, of course, oftentimes is called KDD, but also anybody working on this would be looking at being able to scale up, right? And that a period ended with 2012 declaration of the Big Data Initiative by White House. I mean, I'm sort of putting it at the end, right? And if you go back and read the initiative's declaration, it's all about data, scalable analytics, and there's a very small mention of machine learning, and there's no mention of AI. Okay? And then right around 2012 is also the period when this current revolution started. The AlexNet being used on CNN, which was invented about 30 years before that, 1989. Okay? And then it led to this Google Translate seeing quantum leap, which happened because of 2014, Word2Vec, the self-supervision being in good action, AlphaFold, salts, protein folding, big scientific advance. 2017, the Transformers, Attention is All You Need paper was published, which came out of our ability to model languages. That was the primary reason for it, and that led to a scientific advance. And then, and at the end of it, of course, your landing with foundation models, ChatGPT, and they were all driven by this series of these models and a few other things that happened on the side. So basically, 2014 of 2024, generative AI and foundation models are extensively used in all science and application. Right? So this is the state of the art. But what I like to be able to say as a concluding remarks is that most of these recent advances that are sort of driving the craze or the excitement, whatever you want to call it, in the last 12 years are driven by two applications, computer vision and language modeling, right? The AlexNet came out of the vision and the language modeling. And what resulted out of them, whether you call self-supervision, whether you call transformers, whether you call foundation models, it all came out of those two applications, right? And what I'm trying to sort of state here is that the next revolution in AI is going to be driven by a wider class of scientific problems. Okay? And I show here on the top the two little blue boxes, and those are the NSF workshops that one of them we held at the NSF headquarters. Many of you were there in the audience, or some of you were there in the audience, and the second one we just held about 4 weeks ago. So these are the workshop on AI-enabled scientific revolution. So the second bullet is saying, look, there is the next revolution in AI could happen because of scientific discipline, the kinds of gatherings that you are part of, because this is all about AI for science, right? And the last bullet that I would like to be able to sort of leave you with is sort of more of a hypothesis, is that the KGML is one such advance that has the potential to address not just scientific problems that we just talked about, not for them they have been developed, but some of the biggest gaps in AI at the current stage, that's the lack of trustworthiness, explainability, fairness. Tanya in her talk gave this morning, gave a whole bunch of things that the traditional machine learning cannot do. All of those things have to be addressed in the scientific domain. And if you address them, you can potentially address many, many other limitations as well. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
For the very inspiring talk. We can open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Vipin, and it shows the breadth of knowledge and work that you have amassed in this field. So I have two questions, and I think there's lots of other questions, so maybe I'll hold my second one for later. But the first question I had was around the terminologies that we hear around physics-driven machine learning and physics-informed machine learning and knowledge-guided machine learning. So could you first, tease it apart for us? And then secondly, for the knowledge-guided machine learning, is there room for unstructured knowledge as well as structured knowledge going into the machine learning as well?
Absolutely, great question, because I get this question all the time, right? But I think the one thing one should remember is that the stream of machine learning, scalable analytics, the predictive models that our community has been working on going back into the last 3, 4, 5, 6 decades, depending on how far you want to go back, one could say that it's always has been using some knowledge of the science. And much of that has happened in the context of feature engineering. That is, if you did not use the right features, you wouldn't be there, right? So one way is that, of course, we are always using scientific. We are always using our knowledge. If I don't know what my problem is, I could always be making a mistake. But this direction that sort of grew up, and for us, it grew up in the context of the expedition on climate change that we were engaged in, that I was leading from 2010 onward. And in one of the midterm review of the expedition, these program managers sort of said, look, what is it that you're doing something different as a result of this expedition? This was in 2012. And that's when we sort of got together and sort of saying, what is it? Are we just doing data mining that you would do in any other context? And then we sort of said, look, everything that we are doing is like being informed. It's the approaches that we are building would not have been possible without the scientific knowledge, and then the new kind of approaches. So for us, that was the revelation. So for us, it goes back to 2012. In 2000, as I started talking about it, people said, write a perspective article. We wrote one in 2014. It was very shallow. Then Anuj wrote a very, very extensive one in 2007, which literally serves the foundation for a lot of things that are going on. But these ideas, when he wrote that 2017 article, already in that article, you will see about 100 papers coming from nearly every discipline that had this element of bringing scientific knowledge in machine learning. So to me, the fact that people call it with different names doesn't bother me. To me, it's a community that's growing. So it's almost like if you go back to the 60s, people were building these neural networks, first generation ones. They're coming from different directions, right? In the 80s, people were building this AI model. They were coming from different directions, right? So to me, all of those works are very relevant. And what this perspective that I pointed to tries to do is put them into an umbrella that's easily understandable. So what I'm trying to say is that indeed, these things get called by different names. But for us, we just need to understand that they are part of a family. There's a structure to it. And there are a lot of holes in that structure in the sense that what we were able to do 5 years ago, we can do a lot more 3 years ago, we can do a lot more 2 years ago. And I can tell you in the last 6 months, I have learned a lot more, right? So it's a continuous process. So, and it's a journey, and which is why I put the last bullet that is potentially, if you develop this enough, when I say KGML could handle fairness, see the fairness appears in KGML context in the form of heterogeneity. I have a lot of data in one basin, no data in the other place. So if I take a model from the highly observed region, it gets very poor performance in the other region. We complain about image recognition softwares working well for certain racial groups, but very poorly for a different group. Same problem, you have a highly observed region and you have poorly observed group. So you have to, how do you transfer this information? So a lot of these problems potentially could be captured within that framework, and you bring in the knowledge to solve it. I have not done that, so this is a potential, which is why I've sort of said this is a vision that is maybe the community using these techniques could potentially handle some of this most vexing problem about making the AI trustworthy and fair and explainable. Yes. Oh, yeah, okay. And then, yeah, I guess you should manage that.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. Appreciate it. Appreciate the last bullet point about trustworthiness, explainability, and fairness. I think you addressed the trustworthiness and fairness, but I'm wondering about explainability and how KGML can potentially address that gap in current AI.
Absolutely. So there are, I sort of gave you a long series of examples in terms of how scientific knowledge is working with it. So one of the example I showed you about this being able to make predictions into the future for a NOAA hydrologist. That is, you're standing today and you're trying to make sure what's going to happen 7 days from now. And these hydrologists literally, I mean, there are 13 NOAA centers around the country. One of them happens to be in Minneapolis, which is responsible for 5 states nearby. At that, there are about a dozen hydrologists. Each one has a couple of basins they're responsible for. They're looking at the data, they have the process model giving them guidance, and they want to make predictions into the future, right? So basically, because this work is jointly collaborative with them, they were shocked that this machine could do so much better than anything that they know of, which it does not involve human. Now, when you do involve human, it turns out because humans have the knowledge, the human knowledge does slightly better than KGML framework in the next 24 hours, even though humans are using the bad process model. But beyond 24 hours, the machine does much, much better. But machine doesn't have access to the human knowledge, right? So there they sort of say, we want to use the machine, but can we make sure that we understand what the machine is doing? And it turned out that the framework that was built in such a way that they could relate the components of this KGML model to the characteristics they understand on the lab. And why could they do that? Because the model was built to mimic the processes and their interactions and different scales. So I at least have one example in which the explainability is helping the NOAA hydrologist say, yes, it's something I can use, otherwise I wouldn't be able to use it. Thank you. Oops, but I will let somebody else monitor it.
Great, I'll go.
Yes.
My name is Leanna. I'm coming from Virginia Tech, statistician, however. And so with that, some of the things you said about the process modeling, I didn't exactly agree with, but I am a statistician, and with that, I value Bayesian methods. And Bayesian methods certainly tick a lot of the boxes that you were gaining in terms of the knowledge guided. One question I have, and maybe Anuj can take me aside to explain, is the way by which you include uncertainty in the knowledge that you add, right? So we Bayesians include that probabilistically, and we're able to say probabilistically how confident we are in the knowledge. How does that happen here? And do you take time to think about the sensitivity of your predictions, including different sources of knowledge or degrees of knowledge?
Absolutely. And again, I go back to Tanya's slide. She had a whole bunch of things. What are the metrics? Uncertainty. Uncertainty was one of them in her example as well. Uncertainty is key because we treat in machine learning uncertainty rather superficially. But it turns out that these KGML models also have the opportunity to give you better uncertainty. That's one slide I missed out. I had to pick and choose, but there is one example which is actually found very impressive by our collaborators at USGS, is that one of the simple ways people would build the uncertainty in machine learning models is by using dropouts. They will sort of say, I build a model and I'm just going to drop some connections randomly and see what the variations are, right? And it turns out, of course, you do dropouts, you will get uncertainty bounds, right? But the question is, how good are those bounds? Because we know the truth, are they mapping it precisely, right? Now, this KGML model, again, a different one that I did not show you here at all, built using under the variational framework, was able to do an extremely good job of computing uncertainty. That's one thing. The second thing is it was the inverse modeling framework. It also was able to build the inherent characteristics in the form of embeddings. These are just vectors. But then small number of those vectors were able to capture much of the power and variability that you expect in the region. So what I'm trying to say is that, number one, very limited work in this area. Number two, of all the papers, I can find you only 2 of them that deal with uncertainty, right? Despite the fact that we should always be working on uncertainty. But at least in the second one of them, we're able to show that, yes, there's a hope that you could do a far better job of capturing uncertainty than we can do with traditional business as usual approach that we are doing.
Yeah, thanks for the very inspiring talk. My question is about another trend in AI called neurosymbolic AI. If people want to see as another way to combine the physical knowledge, others even reasoning with neural network, where the name is good because they are saying this 2 parts can actually be equal, because right now with kind of knowledge guided machine learning still focus on machine learning. But for neurosymbolic AI, it can be machine learning for reasoning, but reasoning for machine learning. What's your take? The difference between these two? Are they the same thing, just different term?
I would say they're not the same thing, but it's a promising direction. And I would take you back again to the middle column of this. If you were a student, like I was in the late 70s and the early 80s, there was a raging debate in AI about the declarative versus procedural. I don't know if anybody remembers that. The logic-based, knowledge-based approach versus the procedures that you would write, the rules that you would write, right? So one of the independent of this KGML thread, there have been discussions about how do you bring in the other aspects of AI in the traditional machine learning framework. So I think there is a lot of room for merging even different threads within AI as you go back to 70 years of history. And neurosymbolic, I would say, is one of them. So this is how I would put it. But this is not a replacement for KGML, but it's like these are all the directions in which you're trying to bring multiple threads together to get to where you want to get to. Yes.
All right. Very, very good.
All right.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. So thanks for the great talk. It's nice to hear about all these AI algorithms kind of doing all these great things. But I wanted to know if you'd comment a little bit about the data that goes into the algorithms, because it's often the case these days that data is biased. There's always missing elements of the data, and there are strategies that we can do to kind of make it better. But I feel like this part of the AI community is often a little more obsessed with the algorithms than the data, right?
Great question. But in our book on data mining, we have an entire chapter on exactly those topics. So what I'm saying is that indeed, you're right.
How many other chapters on algorithms do you have?
Most people don't worry about it, but it's the most important thing. If you have garbage in, there's a garbage out, right? I think that's the most important part. I always advise my student to make sure that you look at the data, somehow understand it before you proceed. But I would still add on top of it, because having worked with the physical scientist in this area for about 25 years, in the beginning we relied entirely on them cleaning and giving us the good quality data, right? And now increasingly the latest generation of techniques are such that they are much more tolerant of the poor quality data. I mean, the state of the art today versus 10 years ago is dramatically different. So I'm trying to say two things. One is garbage in, garbage out. That'll always be there, right? Second thing is that do not ignore the advances that we have made in the last column, in the sense that it's a mixed message. I'm paying tribute to everything that has been done in the last 12 years. It's just phenomenal. While simultaneously saying that if you think this is all there is need to be done, then we are headed for disaster. Right? Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, Claude Tamis, very good talk. And I was very, very happy with your presentation. But my question will also be related to the statistician.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm trying to understand fairness as related to the input and the posterior, I would say posterior and prior knowledge involved in the knowledge-guided machine learning. If you can explain more about that, because the fairness as related that, it will be highly influenced by the prior knowledge, which is if people are involved in that process.
Right. So okay. So excellent point. I think if I got your point right, I think the concern is this knowledge, is the methodology always going to be constrained by what I know about the field, right? Okay. So, and that's a very, very important point. I'm glad you mentioned that, right? And when we held this first NSF workshop on AI-enabled scientific evaluation at NSF headquarters last March, this point actually was discussed very extensively. That is, one way you could increase progress at the intersection of AI for science is fund more research at the intersection of AI for science in different communities, which is exactly what's happening. NSF leadership said, look, we are funding so many AI institutes, we are funding so many HDR institutes. What else do you need? So the community, the group of people who got collected there, they sort of said a bunch of things. If you go back and read the report of that workshop, it's beautifully written because it's a collection of people's comments. They sort of said, each of these advances are being made in different disciplines, in AI, in the context of discipline, but it's very hard to take them out from one and take it to the other, right? If I am working on region, let's say in biology, how do I take that advance to geosciences, for example, and vice versa? So there were a couple of recommendations there, and one of them was very specific, and one of them was that how do we build the ecosystems for the AI community that make it as easy for them to work on scientific problems as it is for them to work on computer vision and natural language model. If you go to all of these AI and data mining conferences worldwide, there are about 10,000 papers published each year. Okay? These are papers published by people who are in computer science and related field. They're all producing gadgets. They're all producing algorithms. And you can imagine that none of the people in the field are reading the 10,000 papers, right? You know, it's a cycle that's happening. It's all being driven by the benchmarks from the vision and language community. And the thing is, if you come up with a new method, you better show that you have X% improvement on something published before on a benchmark. So we are driven by those two applications by design. So we have to change that format in such a way that we can do more generic advances in machine learning in the context of sciences, not focused to specific scientific problems. So this needs to be done. It's a recommendation, and KGML perhaps is the direction in that step in that direction.
All right. I think with that thought, let's close the keynote talk. Let's thank again Vipin for the wonderful talk. And if you have any further questions, you can catch him at the break too.